Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Casey. I'm the director of the Berkley Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to what I hope is a really robust discussion. This is an amazing product, a book that I hope you will all purchase and read. But thank you for taking times out of your busy schedule to join us here at midday. I often talk about the intellectual firepower of the Berkley Center faculty and staff, and today I think we have Exhibit A in this collection of essays and in the production of three of my colleagues here, as well as other contributors, and it's just a wonderful opportunity as director of this center to welcome all of you and for us to take a look and listen to a robust discussion on this incredibly important topic. The book, Islam, Gender, and Democracy in Comparative Perspective, critically engages a far too simple binary opposition between, on the one hand, liberal advocates of secular democracy, and on the other hand, Muslim religious opponents of women's full equality. By reframing this debate around Islam and women's rights within a broader comparative literature, leading scholars from a range of disciplines examine the complex and contingent historical relationships between religion, secularism, democracy, law, and gender equality. With us today are the two book editors, Jocelyne Cesari, who's a senior fellow here at the Berkley Center, where her work focuses on Islam and world politics, and an associate professor of the practice of religion, peace, and conflict resolution in Georgetown's Department of Government, and also José Casanova, who is a senior fellow here, where his work focuses on globalization, religions, and secularization, as well as contributor Katherine Marshall, who is also a senior fellow here at the Berkley Center, where she leads the center's work on religion and global development, and is a professor of the practice of development, conflict, and religion at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. We're also honored to have our dear friend Azza Karam with us. Welcome, Azza. She will be a respondent. She serves as the Senior Advisor on Culture at the United Nations Population Fund, where she coordinates the UNFPA-wide outreach with faith-based partners, and she chairs the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. It's great to have you here. And I now turn it over to Jose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you. And again, also a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to serve as moderator because I'm not going to really take ownership of the book. I'm going to say that my role was rather marginal, and therefore I cannot represent the book as a whole. I mean, I'm very proud of it. Before, I'm so proud that actually we know it's a very expensive book. It costs $90-somewhat, but you can buy it at author's price, which means half price. So the price we pay for it, we can sell it to you, which is $48 including shipping, $48 including shipping. So again, it's half price of what you can get in Amazon. It's still too expensive, but unfortunately. But it's a very good book. I mean, truly a good book. I mean, my role was basically, I can claim no expertise on Islam. My role was to serve a bit as convener. Obviously, we had discussions with Jocelyne. We've worked together on many issues, different projects. But this was something that really we thought it was necessary. As social scientists, to bring together debates, discourses, conversations going on within Islam, Muslim scholars, religious people, and then social scientists. And very frequently, these two conversations don't relate to one another. So we wanted to bring a group of scholars of Islam, and I'm very proud that mostly are female scholars. I am the only, and then Bob Hefner, a prominent scholar of Indonesia and of Islam, are the only males on the project. Otherwise, all prominent Muslim female scholars and female scholars of Islam, covering questions, again, of gender equality, Sharia, all the debates, democracy, state involvement in religion, freedom, religious pluralism, all issues about especially women's rights and gender transformations in majority Muslim countries, and it covers from Indonesia to Morocco and all countries in between. Jocelyne will discuss her own chapter, which is a contribution that brings together discussion on Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Iraq and Syria. So basically very prominent as the core were many of those debates. Katherine brings together a very interesting comparison of Senegal and Bangladesh on issues of precisely gender and development and religion. Two relatively open societies with very tolerant Islam, acceptance of religious pluralism, but with a lot of pushback of Islamist fundamentalism and challenging also gender equality and so on. And then chapters on Iran, on Indonesia, on Malaysia, and then also on Muslims, on Morocco and Tunisia after the Arab Spring, and then on Muslim minorities in non-Muslim countries like India, and the whole debate about the rights of the minority and their own family law, civil law. So the relation between civil law and family law in the conflicts and contestations in India, Greece, as part of the Ottoman Empire, they inherited the old separate family law for Muslims, and Israel, Palestinians and other Muslims in Israel. So again, it covers a lot of ground. There is no particular position. We wanted to make the issue as complex as possible to see how plural and how diverse these issues are handled, and especially we wanted to let as much as possible to see that these Muslim women themselves that are the main actors and the main, if you wish, force on both sides and for those debates. So this is basically what the book tries to do. My own contribution, the comparative perspective, is a chapter on Catholicism. Because as all these debates within Islam and gender were taking place, of course, within the Catholic Church, the hierarchy at least, adopted a very, very also, we could say conservative, we could say fundamentalist position on gender issues, even claiming that gender itself, the concept is ideology. So the ideology of gender. So the paradox is why, despite the kind of, you could say, Catholic resistance on the part of the Catholic Church to not gender equality, but some issues of what could be called the gender revolution, especially in terms of sex-less marriage, abortion, contraception, things that go against what could be the doctrines of the Catholic Church, but every Catholic country in the world has more or less, if not accepted, at least contributed. So I want to explain the paradox that when the democratization of Catholic countries took place, gender issues had not yet emerged. Therefore, it did not endanger, if you wish, the conservative position of the Catholics on gender was not a part of the debate in the transitions. And when the gender contestations came, democracies were already consolidated. So it led to polarization, the same way you have polarization in the culture wars in the United States, but it doesn't endanger democracy per se. So again, I discuss from Spain to Poland to Ireland and how basically most of the Catholic countries have adopted laws that basically go against what will be the official doctrines of the Catholic Church on divorce, contraception, abortion, and so on. Even Malta has accepted laws, the most Catholic country. Only the Philippines, the only country that has not passed laws on divorce. But even there, last year was a very, very controversial law of reproductive health. And again, those are very, very also contested debate in Catholic countries. But this is not the focus. I simply wanted to present it. It is not only a question of Muslim countries, but why the things are different in Muslim countries than in Catholic countries. And to explain what is different about Muslim countries, let's turn the floor to, please.
Stand because I have a few slides. Better. Good afternoon. So, as it has been said already, the goal of this book was to bring together two different threads of literature that do not speak to each other. As you know, there is a huge literature on women's rights and Islam, mostly done by scholars of Islam or gender studies scholars. A few names come to mind: Laila Ahmed, Margot Badran, Afsaneh Naqshbandi, and Amina Wadoud. So you have this thread of literature discussing the status of women's rights in the Islamic tradition. And you have a second thread, which is about Islam and democracy, that is mostly written by social scientists and especially political scientists. And they also talk about women's rights in the democratization process, but they never read the whole wealth of literature from the scholars of religion or scholars of Islam. And I just want to give you an example of the missed opportunity or incapacity of dialogue between the two. A scholar wrote a few years ago an article, his name is Stephen Fish, about the connection between Islam, women's rights, and democracy. He's a sociologist. And what he says is that Islam is not at stake at all to evaluate the advancement of democracy in Muslim countries. What you see is a correlation between the lack of democracy and the poor status of women's rights. So he said it's not Islam. But if he knew the situation of women's rights in most of Muslim majority countries, he would have realized that actually this lack of women's rights, first, is not as precarious or as serious as we want to say, one. And second, that most of the obstacles to the development of or expansion of women's rights are related not to secular agenda, but to religious agendas. So linking women's rights and democracy without the component of Islam is here missing something. So how do we combine these two threads? And that's what the book is trying to do, to open a platform of dialogue between scholars of history of Islam, Islamic studies, hermeneutic of the Quran, that are bringing something to the discussion, and social scientists who try desperately to find some kind of analytical framework to look at Islam and democracy. So how do we do that? The first thing was to bring, as José has said it better than I do, so I'm not going to review the disciplinary and also background about different countries brought by the co-authors we had, which was also the reason why we had very healthy, passionate discussion, because we do not talk from the same lens of analysis. As the mathematician Poincaré said, any kind of result depends on the scale you are looking at, right? There is nothing in absolute. So to bring everybody together, we had to deconstruct first the narrative that is dominant in the concept of political science when it comes to democratization and secularization. And you have the dominant narrative is that democratization, secularization, and women's rights go hand in hand. And these come from, first, a certain naive observation or absorption of the European or Western history in general. And you have also historians and scholars like José who have debunked this idea that these three components go together. And what we tried to do was to complexify the approach about democracy and secularization by looking at the women's rights evolution. So what does it mean? It means that you cannot take for granted that democratization and secularization first go hand in hand. Most of secularization processes in the Muslim majority world came from authoritarian, despotic regime. Think of Bourguiba in Tunisia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, and I can go on and on and on. So the secularization process in Muslim country was right at the start, disconnected from the democratization process. And this is something to keep in mind, so to speak. So then we enter the challenge that the concept by which we understand or try to analyze this country today is flawed, because we look at Turkey, Iraq, Egypt to a certain extent as secular countries. Right? And so when I say we, it's not all of us, it's the scholars of politics. And when we do that, we use categories that have been embedded into a certain assumption, again, that may have worked in European history, that secularization means separation of the state and the religious organization, privatization of religion, and decline of personal religiosity. I'm not going to go on that, because scholars of religion like José have also debunked the association of combination of these three elements. So we expect that countries outside the West will check on these three boxes. The problem is they don't. Take secular country like Turkey or Egypt. There's never been an institutional separation of religion and state in Turkey. Actually, what the nation state did is something that never happened in the empire, in the Muslim empire, which is to nationalize the clerics, the endowment, the school, and the University of Islamic Education, in a way, again, that didn't exist in the Ottoman Empire. So the clerics lost their autonomy of thinking, of acting, of operating as guide for the religious communities. And again, this happened in Turkey. So when I hear Turkey is a secular country, what are we talking about? The institutional separation that we associate with secularization didn't happen in the majority of Muslim countries, exception Indonesia, Senegal, and Lebanon. Lebanon being maybe the only sectarian democracy that you could qualify that. But then you will tell me, but look what happened in Turkey. Women lost the veil, the whole Islamic symbolism disappeared. Yes, this is a second level of secularization, which is the social level. And again, in our concept in politics, we tend to associate both. We think that if there is an institutional separation, there is also a social secularization. But it doesn't, what I see in Muslim majority country is no separation, actually nationalization of religion of one dominant thread of Islam, not of all thread of Islam, and only Islam, which means that, again, if I am an Alevi in Turkey, I am not an equal to the Sunni Hanafi Muslim. This was done by Kemalists, secular, not by Islamists. There was a component here of Islamic belonging and national belonging combined together that is, again, unprecedented in the history of Muslim empire and the status of Islam pre-modern or pre-nation state. So this is one thread that will have an impact on Muslim women's rights. Why? Because in an authoritarian way, these nationalists indeed advanced the cause and the status of women. That's where, unlike what people think, Muslim women have more rights than, the Saudi or Afghani vision would let us think. Economic rights, political rights, social rights. I just want to show you a couple of slides to illustrate this, if I have the clicker somewhere. So, for example, here, this is 2014, it has not changed a lot. Women in political position So you have India, France, the US, Algeria, Tunisia, Pakistan, Morocco, Turkey. Look at the Muslim countries do not do as bad as the Western countries. And this we tend to forget. This is what the advancement of women's rights was. This capacity to get empowerment politically, also economically, also in education. These are something, again, on which the institutional role of the nation state is neglected. Because when Islamists are claiming rights or empowerment of Islam, they don't go back to the pre-modern Medina time of the Prophet to forge their claim. They go back to what they have been socialized in, which is a national culture where Islam is part of the belonging and collective identity. And in this respect, all the women are not going to let go about that. Think of what happened in Turkey. We have now witnessed the power of Islamists for more than 2 decades. They have not touched on the rights of women as such in this domain. And women are not ready, even if they vote for Erdogan, are not ready to let go about that. Another interesting slide in the same economic participation and opportunity. You see, US for women. These are. You don't have you have a difference, of course, because these are not democracy either. But what you have is not as low as you think it should be or could be when you hear the alarmist discourse about the oppressed, alienated, absent Muslim women. Then you will tell me, yes, but then what about, other rights related to dress code? Yes, that's a second set of rights. And we have to be clear again to unpack here between what I call, tentatively, what I call individual rights that are pertaining to economy, politics, education, social activities, and the rights of the person, which tends to sexuality, family, children. And here, and that's what the comparison with the Catholic country was interesting. Here you see a clear setback, and again, not because the Islamists have decided so, because most of Muslim majority countries built by the secular nationalists have put Sharia, a reconstruction of Sharia, as an element of civil law. You do not have civil secular law in most of Muslim countries, the exception being Turkey. Meaning all civil law is based on Islamic prescription about marriage, divorce, custody of children. And again, this was negotiated with the clerics at the time of the independence by the secular. So yes, women were unveiled, but at the same time, they didn't get in this particular area the equality that they got outside in politics or economy or education. And that's what I try to distinguish between the rights of the individual as a category of person active in society and the rights of the self, meaning the body, the reproduction, the sexuality, the transmission. And this remains deeply ingrained in Islamic prescription. Again, that you cannot read from the medieval theologies, but that you have to read from the debate that occurred at the time of the end of the Ottoman Empire and beginning of the nation state, where you see an intense theological debate about reframing the Sharia and associating it with the state. That's where the Sharia becomes state law, while for any Islamist, Sharia is not state law. Sharia is a methodology used by clerics to come to a ruling. But today, what do Islamists ask for? An Islamic state. They're not asking for Sharia as a methodology because they have been socialized in this particular context, because their claim is socialized by the level of rights, the level of understanding and expectation that come from being a member of these new political communities. I don't want to go on and on too long on that. So interestingly, if we look at religious prescription in civil law, Muslim countries are not alone. That's why we had the comparison with Israel. Israel is a very interesting case. It's a democracy. There is no secular law in Israel. If you want an intermarriage between two citizens, and religious intermarriage, people have to get married outside. So then you can compare, you see. And so the question here is about comparison of what is comparable. What do people are claiming for? What do women are mobilizing about? I mean, the whole debate is really about mastering your body. And the women body has become the site of contestation between secular and Islamist. Not, I mean, again, do not think, except if you look at Saudi Arabia as the standard, and that's why I want to say clearly, Saudi Arabia is an outlier. I know that we tend in the West to look at it as the norm of true Islam or traditional Islam. It is not. Most of Muslim majority countries have advanced the women's rights. Iran is a paradox in this sense. In Iran, covered Muslim women are outnumbering men in universities. They have highly paid jobs. They are highly educated. But when it comes to family, they cannot divorce their husband. They can run for presidential election, but they cannot divorce their husband. So these are the kind of discrepancy that as scholars we have to take into account if we want to understand the situation of women's rights, Islam, and democracy. And we tend, because our Western history mold or influence the concept we are, to make all these associations. This democracy, secularization, advancement of women's rights. Actually, if we read some historian, and we have in the book a chapter by John Scott that shows that the secularization process in France moved the boundary between private and public. And actually women were pushed in the private and denied some kind of rights. So again, I'm talking about my discipline here at social science and political analysis. We tend to fossilize or work on assumptions. And we need, because we have to create variables from concepts, forgetting all these processes and contexts. We tend to associate democracy, secularization, advancement of women's rights, while they don't. And we tend to think that all human rights and women's rights are given or granted in one package. Even in European history, it didn't go this way. But we expect outside the West that this is the way to go. While we see clearly that in some areas, religion or also culture, that's why we have a whole example with India as well, because the debate is exactly the same in secular democratic India. You have this impingement or influence of religious dimension on the civil law. And that's why you see emerging this tension about the self. And for me, living in the US now, when you hear about the discourse of women's rights here, you see that you can also make this kind of comparison. What is at stake today in the equality between citizens? It's sexual minority, sexual rights. This is a debate also happening in Muslim countries when it comes to rights or human rights and also women's rights. I'm going to just close on two things. First, to say that also we have to be cautious about sort of irreversible process of improvement. Because what we see also that in some cases the rights of women are regressing. Iran is a good example, again, on the domain of family law. Iraq, since the end of Saddam Hussein, you have lots of discussion. Again, the discussion is not so much on political economic right, it's about family law and pulling women under very restrictive interpretation of the Shia family law. And this is a kind of regression. Same thing in Pakistan. Pakistan started as a very secular country, and you have seen emerge laws trying to criminalize some parts of interpersonal relation, like zina, fornication, is a crime in Pakistan. And this happened in the 70s, not at the time of Dr. Jinnah and the independence of Pakistan. So when women are fighting, they're not fighting for women's rights and Islam. They're fighting on very concrete domain, which is to abolish the zina law, for example. So this is also this kind of context that we have to take into account. And the third, final point is also that all these discussions that are grounded in different national history and culture are also influenced by transnational movements and trends, and that's also part of the book showing the influence of what's called Islamic feminism that has swept across Muslim countries and has influenced the advancement of women's rights in some area. For example, the Mudawana, the very equalitarian family code in Morocco that was adopted almost 10 years ago now. I don't have the datation right here. It provides within the Maliki law, and that's the key here. If we want to think of advancement of women's rights, it's very challenging to do it from a secular, completely secular point of view. It has to include justification, discussion from a theological approach. So the Mudawana, discussed by the Maliki clerics, has provided a new framework for equality between men and women. And why did it happen in Morocco? It's because women's rights groups in Morocco were very much connected to the Musawa movement, the equality, the gender equality movement, and the Sisters in Islam in Indonesia. And that this kind of transnational influence has also some kind of impact on the ground. So I'm going to stop here because it's just, in other words, let's not pack everything together, right? And it doesn't serve them. I'm going to finish on a civic, as a citizen. I don't think it is serving women everywhere to say that we're going to go from the West Europe in the moment to liberate them from the oppression of Islam, because things are not as simple as that. And even if we have actors in the West that tend to present this simplified image as scholars, it's not only our, job, but also our duty to try to do this work of looking at things in context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was 2004, the new Mudawana in Morocco.
2004, yeah.
Is somebody getting my slides?
After this one.
Oh, okay. It happened automatically. I'm going to speak about the situation in two Muslim democracies, Senegal and Bangladesh. Three sort of introductory comments. First of all, the work that we did is in the context of what we call country mapping and trying to look at what religion has to do with democracy, but also development, also looking at humanitarian, climate change, et cetera. In other words, the question is, what's religion got to do with it and why does it matter? So we've concluded from looking really at these issues at a very global level of the sort of religion that until you got to the country level, it didn't make much sense. And so two of the 5 countries that we have been working on are Senegal and Bangladesh. And so we essentially tried to bring them into this research project at a fairly late stage. The second point to make, I think, is that in looking broadly at the issues of what's religion got to do with global politics, or, for the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, it is remarkable how often the issues come down to gender and sex and family. They are, in many ways, the topics on which there is the most tension, the most complexity. So in every country situation, on every topic, whether it's water or housing or malaria or maternal mortality, these issues come back to gender relations and questions about how religious factors are involved. The third general comment I would make, I was looking this morning, updating myself on the World Economic Forum Gender Index, and the basic prognosis is it's going to take about 100 years at the current rate of progress to get anywhere near equality. So these are issues very much at a global level. I spent many years working at the World Bank, and one of my frustrations on gender issues is that there's a lot of talk, but far less action, far less clarity on what are really the tools for change. So I think it's within this context that we have been looking at various countries, including Senegal and Bangladesh. So the first thing to remind ourselves is that these are 2 countries that are 6,800 miles apart. Different continents, completely different history, different culture, and yet they happen to be the 2 countries that are perhaps the most renowned as successful Muslim democracies with large Muslim majority populations. So we didn't pick them for that reason, but I think they do have a particular interest. They both have great complexities around the provisions of constitutions which are explicitly secular. So in Senegal, you have what's called secularism, laïcité à la sénégalaise, sort of a very sort of particular kind of secular, which is distinguished from laïcité à la française. So the question then, what does that really mean? But you also have enormously powerful religious influences that extend in ways that we don't completely understand and that are changing. So that's the Senegalese situation. The Bangladesh situation is even more interesting. Jose actually came to a forum that we organized in Dhaka because you have contradictions within the constitution. So you have a constitution that was established as deliberately secular, but then you have an overlay, an amendment, which makes it into an Islamic country, and very little public debate as to what the tension and the contradiction means. So even at the most basic level of constitutional provisions, you have all kinds of issues. In both countries, one of the things that we look at, even though it's one of these puzzles as well, is the data on religiosity. But in both countries, religion is enormously important. If you ask people how important is religion, the answers are skyrocketing right at the top. But then the question comes, what does that really mean in terms of the way people live their daily lives, in terms of the way politics evolves, et cetera. So you have the characteristic of high religiosity. You also have in both countries pride in the distinctive Islamic character of both countries, both permeated with Sufi traditions, both of them with great pride in religious tolerance. So in both countries, you have constant examples that people give of celebrating holidays together. And yet, in both countries, you have a sense of unease, of evidence of threats to the traditions of tolerance. And all of this is set against turbulent modernization. enormous social change that's taking place in what were very traditional societies with, I think we should be very clear, very traditional gender relations of the subjugation of women. Women were considered inferior, women were considered less significant without really much in practical evidence of respect or various other terms in practice in both countries. And so both countries, they're sort of mixed in terms of economic performance. Senegal is generally viewed as stable, and for that reason, somewhat miraculous in the neighborhood, but with very little real progress since independence. Bangladesh is a much more successful case, but remember that Bangladesh is almost the quintessential world basket case in terms of development challenges. So even though there has been remarkable progress, it's often thought that it's been despite the government, despite the policies, and the future of Bangladesh is really still full of question marks that have, if nothing else, to do with climate change and the fact that it's 170 million people. I mean, it's an enormously important country. Looking at the World Economic Forum Gender Index, Bangladesh is number 45 in 2017, which is quite interesting because it's gone way up from 64 in 2015. I'm not quite sure why. Senegal is 91, it's gone down. Both of them are by far the strongest in the sort of diamond that's reflected in the index on education and to some extent health. So in other words, the welfare of women has improved rather dramatically, but when it comes to politics, it's far, far less clear. Oops, why did it do that? Oh. So very briefly, looking at Bangladesh, some of the successes is the almost a gender parity in education. So remarkable change. And interestingly, a part of the story there is that it is the Muslim education system which accounts in large measure for, particularly at the secondary level, the approach to gender parity. You have also religious figures very much involved in the success, relative success on family planning. Outside of the religious realm, you have the employment and the role of women in the garment industry. Much more negatively, Bangladesh has one of the highest child marriage rates in the world. And in fact, there's a debate going on now at the lowering the child marriage age with, again, very strong role of the religious side. You have, as a challenge, which could involve the religious actors, one of the highest stunting rates of children in the world. In other words, very serious malnutrition issues. You have important but very complex religious roles with this tension between the secular values and the religious values that are contested formally and informally, particularly around issues of family law. And you do have a pattern, which is to some extent the oversimplified paradigm, where the women's groups tend to be very uneasy about the religious actors and an oil and water situation in human terms. And likewise, a lot of the religious actors are quite uneasy about the women's movements. And yet you also have a very interesting pattern of women reclaiming Islam, of scholarship where they are reinterpreting, reading the Quran in study groups and basically contesting the traditional interpretations. Senegal, you have some similarities. You have, again, to pick up the last point, the oil and water situation, you have very strong women's movements. A lot of international organizations are headed by strong-minded Senegalese women. And you have a number of these women who are openly quite suspicious of the religious actors. They do not see, they would question whether having a discussion would be very worthwhile. And they have tended to frame the issues around reform, law, et cetera, in terms of traditional religious versus modernization and secular. The religious leadership, interestingly, when you ask, we asked, because we're working on various topics, including family planning, the first answer of the religious leadership is that there are not any women in religious leadership and there are not women's religious networks. But that's not true. There are very significant women, both individual leaders, but there's a Dahira system, a network of women's institutions, which is not public, it's not incorporated in any legal sense, but plays a very powerful role. So understanding the informal and the formal has been a very critical issue. You've had in the sort of secular tradition laws that have required women's parity in political representation. But interestingly, the number 2 city in Senegal, which is legally just a village, Touba, the Murid capital, refused to implement the government's provisions on parity. So they have no women. I think that's correct. And nobody has been able to do anything about that. So you have some tensions around parity. And I think in general, and I would point to this both in Bangladesh and Senegal, we're seeing signs of backlash and some signs of backsliding. The issues that we're hearing about quite a bit. And a number of issues. I mean, one, I think we don't have any idea what the data on it is, but there's quite a lot of talk and newspaper articles about levels of infanticide in Senegal, which is not something that's been a tradition in the society, but it is first of all a measure of the desperation of young women. Some of
female infanticide specifically?
No, it's not specifically. It's infanticide in general. And again, we don't know whether this is a perception issue or a reality issue, but it reflects some of the issues around youth and adolescent sexuality and the desperation of young women who get pregnant and the young men who disappear. But so it's around some debates around abortion in cases of rape and incest. As some conclusions, I call it areas to watch. Clearly, we're dealing, and I think this is true for all the countries that Jocelyne and Jose have mentioned, that we're dealing with these issues in a context of remarkable social economic and political transformation, a sort of a turbulence within the societies that clearly plays out in many ways in these gender roles. Societies that were deeply traditional, where women were poor, most of them women of lesser values. A secular discourse has highlighted women's equality and shaped legislation, but it's not reflected in many cases in behavior, with the notable exception of education and to a lesser degree health. In both of the countries, you're seeing enormous changes which are not well understood in the way religious institutions are working and their roles and their power. What is their power, their influence? So you have the situation of the perception and the reality are often quite different. For example, in terms of the roles of the confrérie. You have some strong women leadership models, some positive and some very negative. Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh is often sort of cited as one of the villains in terms of women. You have some specific efforts of women to reclaim their religious roles. And you have the phenomenon of progress despite Islam. Despite Islam, what is the truth, but also what are the complexities? And so I think the bottom line is that there are very challenging times ahead. And these are very important issues that we need to look at in a very granular way and without the lens of the framing of preconceptions.
Now, Azza, who has been looking at these challenges ahead from the global perspective of the United Nations for many, many years, will offer her comments. Yes.
So thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to be here with you today. And I want to extend a sincere thanks to José and Katherine and, of course, Jocelyne for this delightful opportunity to get a free copy of the book and have a chance also to, quite frankly, to be enlightened significantly by reading it. So warm congratulations to Jocelyne and to José for putting this together, and certainly to all the contributors. I really feel that the quintessential value added of this book, and I'm not speaking only as somebody who works in the UN, but as an author of a book in this field and several books and articles in this field, I really feel that this is a value added, and I'll explain why. I think it's a value added largely because of the juxtaposition of Muslim majority countries and what happens there with Catholic majority countries and minority Muslim populations. I think that precisely the juxtaposition of the diversity of existences that women have and how this relates to dynamics of state, agency, legislation, that precisely is the richness, to me, of what I see in this book and the potential that it has to genuinely bring to light, as you've heard from Jocelyne and Katherine, a lot of the nuances that are often overlooked when we talk in stereotypical fashion, and particularly in today's context, when we talk in terms of certain administrations' perception of what it is that should happen to women, and especially to Muslim women. So I think this kind of nuancing with very clear evidence, as you've heard from the various presentations, and there is more, obviously, in the book, this kind of nuancing becomes not only, gee, how nice that we have that, but oh my goodness, how critical that we have this kind of knowledge and documentation in an age where the arguments can often be incredibly superficial and yet be seen as truth, and certainly in an age, forgive me for the cliche, of a lot of fake news. So this becomes worth the weight of the entire box in gold at a minimum. Having said that, I think that it raises a lot, the juxtaposition of articles also bring to light a number of different questions, if you will, that would be helpful for us to think together about and to hear more, especially now that we have the opportunity, from the editors. I note with great delight José's very humble thing about, I didn't really do much. Actually, I thought his article was one of the best in this because it helped to enlighten significantly on one particular issue that those of us who work from a global perspective on the everyday development stuff, one of the issues is really, why on earth is it that in Catholic majority countries, issues of women's sexuality seem to have been far better legislated, even when it goes counter to the religious mainstream? Why is it that that happens better in Catholic contexts relative to Muslim contexts? So it was extremely helpful to read the analysis within the book in the comparative context, but also to read José's own analysis of how this happened and the distancing or the change of the role of the Catholic Church, if you will, vis-a-vis society. And it helped to shed light greatly on a number of the other chapters, and not only because of this particular dynamic, but because it really helped, for me at least, to understand that it goes back, and these are the three main themes, if you will, that I'd like to be able to speak to. It goes back to this whole dynamic of the relationship between the religious and the governance institutions, the institutions of the religious and the institutions of government. And I think that when we speak of Muslim majority countries, and as Jocelyne and many others have highlighted, bless you, in the book, in their respective chapters, we realize that an interesting phenomenon that has largely taken place in many of these Muslim majority countries is that the state has played a very significant role in shaping the religious discourse. In other words, government institutions, and particularly the leadership of certain governance regimes, have played a very important role in fashioning the religious discourse on women and women's rights through the very act of appropriating Islam to justify their own existence as regimes, as political regimes. We see that happen in many countries around the world, and we certainly see it happen particularly in the Arab region, but also in Iran and now Turkey, as Jocelyne pointed out. So what we're noticing is that in this context of the Muslim majority countries, state structures have appropriated religion to justify their own largely, and I'm not speaking as a UN official here, just to be perfectly clear. This is not the UN position. I don't speak as a UN person. I'm speaking as a scholar, not as a UN person. So, largely appropriating religion largely to justify the political legitimacy, which is doubtful in the best of circumstances for many of these political regimes. And in that process of appropriation of the religious discourse, a fashioning of that discourse has taken place. Whereas in Catholic majority countries, we don't necessarily at all, in fact, quite the opposite. There is no appropriation of the religious to justify the political legitimacy of any particular governing regime. And herein lies a very critical difference that I think is very valuable to realize. To put it very crudely, and I think the authors in this book have put it much more professionally, but to put it very crudely, in Arab contexts in particular, but albeit not only, but because I'm from the UN, I'm very sensitive to which countries I mention. Let me speak about my own region. In Arab countries in particular, we note that the religious discourse has been used as a tool by the political regimes, largely to appreciate or to underline their own legitimacy, which is doubtful. And in so doing, this has rendered the entire conversation about Islam and rights to be a contentious area, because it is quintessentially not only about women and their rights, it becomes a contention about the rights of the human beings who are citizens in these countries as a whole. So you can see that that's a direction that the Catholic majority countries have absolutely not gone into. Now, what is even more fascinating and would be interesting to see perhaps in Jocelyne's next book or others' colleagues' next book is how the role of the military in that particular dynamic may quintessentially also add another feature of how human rights in general and women's rights in particular will get impacted by the appropriation by the military institution of Islamic discourse to legitimize their own quintessentially governance mechanism. But that's for the future, one hopes. If any of you have any ideas for a PhD, please consider that. So the relationship between institutions of religion, institutions of government. The other aspect under that, which I think comes out very nicely in the juxtaposition of articles in the book, is that it's actually, believe it or not, rather helpful that within the Catholic dominion you have a church that is called the Vatican, and it has its various affiliates and entities that you can trace and track and see and even map. Whereas in the Muslim context, it's rather difficult to find which institution you're going to highlight the particular discourse of and see how it rolls out. And I think that Jocelyne and colleagues in this book have tried indeed to do that through looking at different schools of thought. But I'm sorry, that is a process that requires a hell of a lot more work. And it's going to simply because the dominion of Islamic discourse is so much more difficult to quantify and categorize and find the respective institutional legitimacy for than you can with the Vatican and their particular spokespersons and so on. So because it is harder to track the way that this discourse, like a stream, flows and goes all over the place, whereas this discourse is coming from a particular, you can see where the origin is and where it's going to go and how it gets instituted and realized in different contexts. And I think that because it becomes more difficult to do that tracking, it also becomes more difficult to make an argument either very powerfully for women's rights or human rights, or very powerfully against. And therefore, the playing field is a hell of a lot more messy, excuse my English, a lot messier in Muslim contexts, including where Muslims are minorities in countries. The playing field is simply far more messy. And therefore, the message that, one of the messages that this book comes out with becomes even more pertinent. How can you possibly stereotype when it's so darn messy? And how can you develop legislation and policies for intervention in these contexts when it's so darn messy? So bearing in mind that messiness, we also realize that messiness creates the opportunity for diverse discourses of rights, women's rights, and for diverse manners of manifestation of the agency of women in these particular contexts, whether they are minorities in certain European and Western countries, or whether they are the majorities in their own countries. Precisely because it's so messy, there is room for maneuver. Jocelyne mentioned the transnational connection between a group called Sisters in Islam, which is based in Malaysia, and their influence, quote unquote, that is ostensibly traceable in Morocco, even though I take issue with that quite a bit. But let's take it for the sake of argument that indeed and of course there are connections made between Sisters in Islam and the impact of their discourse in Morocco and presumably elsewhere. If we take that argument, because we believe that the transnational connections do indeed matter, and this is another element, by the way, of the religion and politics nexus. But because these transnational connections matter, they're actually possible precisely because of the messiness of the politics in Muslim contexts and the agency of claiming rights in Muslim majority contexts. So the transnational becomes possible. Because it's behind the scenes, it is a doorway to impact on a king, which you may have as a leader of a particular women's movement or women's rights movement that you may not have if you were trying to get an audience with the Pope, right? So just those dynamics of institutions and how they're built or structured, probably a great deal more difficult to get an audience with the Pope as a human rights activist, but probably much more possible, by the way, as a Muslim rights activist in a monarchy in the Arab region. I know because I've been part of that conversation in many cases. So yeah, it is actually possible to get an audience with the king. Do not know how possible it is for some of women's rights activists of the same caliber with the same arguments to get the ear of the Pope or anybody near the Pope. So yeah, great. It's messy. Opportunities are found in messiness. And another element about the relationship between the religious and the governance institutions is the dynamic of opposition. We know that the discourse of political Islam in particular, and this is one thing I am missing in this book, the discourse of political Islam is usually the other. When it comes to feminism, the other is political Islam, and the women in movements of political Islam. We're still not very comfortable with these women. And I was happy to see the reference in Katherine's article, but it's a tentative reference to the women who join what is quintessentially the far right of the Muslim political spectrum. These women present us with a major issue, those of us who are working in the sort of the mainstream of the women's rights movement. The women who join Islamist movements are a bit of an enigma at best. At worst, quite frankly, they challenge our very existence and the floor on which we stand, because the presumption that you will, in today's realm, you will take up arms to kill somebody else who might have been your cousin or your sister, actually, because you believe that that's the right thing to do, that your God tells you that's the right thing to do, that's a hard thing to swallow. And so while we have a great deal of research that's actually been done about women in these movements, that still remains the other in that realm of trying to unpack and understand how the conversation and the discourse between religion, rights, and democracy/governance takes place. Interestingly, this leads me to another interesting point in terms of trying to look at the nuances and the questions that this book raises. We have a very real dynamic in today's context, which remains relatively ill-studied. To be honest, I think that the relationship between women's rights, Islam, and democracy, if we are to look beyond the realm of English language, we would find that that relationship has actually been studied quite extensively. So there's my phone? No, that's not my ring. Definitely not my ring. But I'm reminded of Dustin Hoffman in that movie. Definitely not mine. Yeah. Now I think we do have. It's quite okay. We do. I'm just so glad it's not mine. We do have quite a bit of literature in Arabic, actually, on that relationship between Islam, democracy, rights. And I really think that we need to realize that the knowledge and the wisdom contained here is enriched by the comparisons, but it can be enriched further if we were to open the doors of our own knowledge to knowledge written in other languages. Because if we do so, we will realize that there's plenty that's already been studied and analyzed for years. I know for a fact that this book was translated into Arabic, and parts of it were translated into Spanish, and parts of it translated into Bahasa, yet the book has not got a single mention. It's just not there. It's as if this knowledge doesn't exist at all. A bit odd. It's not just because it's my book, but I looked at a couple of other colleagues, Hala Mustafa, Nabil Muhammad, who wrote about these issues, not mentioned, even though some of their work got translated from Arabic into English into French. So I think we do have a challenge still, even with the technology that we have today, to be able to actually reference all the knowledge out there. And Jocelyne referenced quite a bit the Arab Human Development Report that the United Nations Development Program stewarded. I was part of that process. And in that report, we recognize that one of the deficits in the Arab region is indeed a deficit of knowledge. But we were critiquing the Arab region for not knowing enough, not producing enough knowledge, not being open to enough knowledge in the Arab region. Yet we didn't critique, and we still don't, that the so-called Western, enlightened, technology advanced part of the world doesn't have enough knowledge. Thinks it does, but it doesn't yet have all that scope of knowledge that is produced in other languages. And the analysis that comes out of that tends to remain missing. And that's an area that we need to be a bit more sensitive to as we go forward. And last but by no means least, I was also very enriched and delighted to see this, finally, the idea of women's rights as not just encompassing political rights and economic rights and so on, but the way that Jocelyne and the other authors unpacked the linkage between social political rights and economic rights and sexual rights, which is often that, again, the other of the area of study of women's rights and human rights. It's that the sexuality part is the most contentious. And it's interesting that it's very contentious for mainstream feminists in many parts of the world, as it is contentious for religious actors. You know, that's a domain that we don't really want to go into too much. Whereas, in fact, if you look at what's going on in many of the legislative dynamics in the Western Hemisphere in particular, you realize that domain is moving at a gallop. Sexual rights is no longer such a contentious issue in many parts of the Western Hemisphere. It still remains a deeply contentious issue, largely in the Eastern Hemisphere. However, what this book also shows through the various articles is that the nuancing between and the need, and this is an argument made very well by Mala Hatun, which was quoted quite a bit here, both in Jocelyne's as well as in José's articles, that you have to disaggregate what you mean by women's rights. And further then, the argument I would make is disaggregate what we mean by sexual rights. Yeah, because we have that in the UN context very much. I did not know it, to be perfectly honest with you. In spite of having worked in this field for the last 25 years before I joined the UN system and before I joined UNFPA, which is the UN Population Fund, I honestly did not know that one had to distinguish between reproductive rights and sexual rights, and within sexual rights to distinguish between A, B, C, D, E. I'm learning about this. But as I'm learning, I realize that the academic sphere of knowledge production hasn't necessarily cottoned on to those different elements that come under reproductive rights and sexual rights. And that if we were to do so, we would be able perhaps to try to better understand why abortion is not necessarily treated in the same way in Catholic majority countries or Muslim majority countries, is not seen in the same way that gay marriage is, right? And that this dynamic, yes, indeed has to do with the religious and parts of the religious conversation. But how? And how does that play out exactly, that abortion should be seen differently in the Muslim majority countries from gay marriage? Why would gay marriage be acceptable to some extent, even at a public level conversation, than abortion, or vice versa? And what is it that triggers, bless you, the acceptability of this and not of that? And yet these are both sexual rights. And so then you begin to see, and I think this is what Justin and others have also charted a little bit, how it is that the conversation, even though it is supposed to be all about Islam and Islamic theology and schools of thought, yet there's going to be a different influence on how relationships between men and men, sexual relationships between men will be seen differently than abortion, whereupon that is a woman doing something to her own body, which is less acceptable in some contexts than men deciding to have sex with each other. Interesting dynamics which have a lot to do with schools of thought, but they can also have a lot to do with the socialization. And this was the other thing that was very brilliant about the analysis in the book, is it distinguished between the socialization and the Muslim theology, which is a bridge too far for some people in some administrations. We don't need to mention where. One of the last things that I think is almost as a sort of, I would posit as an invitation. Those of us who work in the realm of policies and praxis still need to appreciate and understand where the current dilemma we're in now, which is one where the way that women have and will and have already participated in whether you call it Christian fundamentalist or Jewish fundamentalist or Islamist, that the way in which women have participated in these movements and continue to participate in these movements, that realm of knowledge will have implications for sure, probably already is, on the entire conversation about human rights, not just women's rights, but the entire conversation and evolution of the human rights agenda. We don't know yet what the implications will be. But you can well imagine that an implication that will be there on a human rights agenda will for sure have an implication on the democratization and governance agendas. And the last thing I would leave you with is my fear, a very real fear, that we are now in a context, and you heard Katherine refer to this quite a bit, we're in a context where religion is indeed becoming the subject matter and normal as an area of intervention for secular, previously very secular institutions of international development and humanitarian assistance and human rights. So 10 years ago, to talk about religion was, what on earth are you on about? Today, it's a really sexy thing. Let's do this on religion. This is faith-based. This is faith-inspired. Let's invite these religious leaders here, there, and everywhere. We don't know why, but we have to do it. It's a good idea to do it. Now that this trend is indeed happening, and many of us actually pushed for this to be the normal, but now that this is the normal, there is a very real concern that the folks that we convene around the table, which we are normalizing and saying these are equal partners to us in every way, shape, and form, some of these folks have very, what's the polite way of saying this? Have somewhat archaic perspectives on women's rights agendas, specifically women's sexual rights areas. And if we normalize those people, they come with a baggage of those particular kinds of discourses. The implications of that for the what you heard before in terms of regression or frankly jeopardizing a great deal of the legislative rights that have taken place, we don't know yet, but I'm afraid of what those implications will be. As I'm afraid of us ignoring the women who join the movements on the right of the religious spectrum, by ignoring them, by continuing to other that particular dynamic, while we complain that the civic space is being significantly threatened globally, while we complain that democracy is definitely being threatened globally, ignoring where this particular direction of women's engagement in these kinds of movement doesn't serve us very well. It leaves us blind-sided, and I don't think we have a right to be. Those of us who work in institutions and can't get two words together to put an article is another issue. But those of us in the academic arena have an opportunity, and I'd love to be able to see that opportunity manifest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for truly insightful and careful reading of a dense book, which you only received 2 weeks ago, and given your schedule every day, you have a lot of things on your plate and traveling and so on. So thank you very much for this careful reading. We don't have that much time left. Let's open the floor for comments, questions. Maybe let's gather 3 comments, questions, and then we'll give a chance to the people on the panel. So we can go to our 2-3 rounds. If we are quick, we'll go for 2-3 rounds of questions, comments. Please be as brief as possible. Identify yourself. Yes, please.
I'm Jocelyne. I'm from the MBA Muslim community, and thank you so much for the talk and the introduction of the book. I'm from MBA Muslim community. Everybody is waiting for the second coming of Messiah, and we believe that the second coming has already happened, and this is where he's going to bring the true Islam, the women's rights, and all of the rights that needed. And the thing is that from Islam, this is the movement that brings those rights. I know the Christian, they are waiting for Jesus, peace be upon him. But eventually, when he comes in, he gathers everything. And that's why I'm saying that we have spread to 210 countries. And luckily, the women in MDA Muslim community, they are very active, and they have the education. I think we have 95% of women and men are educated. And this is a game change for the political and these things. The thing is, I'm saying that the rights, I can tell you that we bring the true Islam, and it has 11 points with women rights.
So please, we don't have that much time. Thank you very much. As you know, the Ahmadis is one of the controversial groups for a lot of Muslims. They are persecuted in many Muslim countries. There are discussions of these groups, also the Ismailis, another group that have also advanced equal education and a lot of gender rights in there. So there are, again, specific groups within Islam that they are also covered in the book. So please.
That's what I'm saying, that this is the solution to many of the problems that we see.
Thank you very much. Gloria?
Thank you very much. I really had the opportunity to read the whole book because it's in ebook as well. Jose forgot to say also that it is accessible in ebook and Amazon and all of those, marketplaces. And I have it since July. So my question is about the comparison between Muslim countries, which they have their own way of understanding interaction with women, and how the women are taking a role in the liberation way, talking about the feminism, like Mir Hosseini, like Fatima Mernissi, and so on, like Morocco cases, which is very, very well known. And what happened with those women, like in Iran, they took exactly the opposite, not radicalized in a way that they took arms and they went into violence, but how they were in the Khomeini point of view and taking that side. There are some studies regarding to both of them, and what are the main differences in the perception of Islam. Another thing that I should like to mention is the comparison between the countries which they have an established tradition in Islamic communities and those who are coming by immigration and are creating a polarized debate, as you know, regarding most likely for arbitration cases following Sharia, which is more or less the example that they are following of the these courts that the rabbinic courts, so-called, or panels, the Big Ten courts. So I should like just to clarify a little bit these two points. Thank you.
Another question, and we can then, please, David.
One question, David Hollenbach is my name. One question that occurs to me, bringing up the situation in Senegal, and where you have Sufi Islam. One of the questions that is interesting to me is, do you have a comparative study of different strands of Islam and how they are relating to democracy and women's rights and so forth? I mean, Sufism is a very different version of Islam than you would find in Iran. And I'm wondering whether there are significant religious sources for the differences that you have studied in this book, not having read the book. That was a question that occurred to me when you were bringing up, especially Senegal.
Yes, briefly on the comparative dimension. It's not an explicitly comparative work in the sense we have not aimed as explicit comparisons. I mean, my own is Catholicism, and obviously the background is what is unique compared with, but I don't enter into a comparison of the two. There are some explicit comparative essays, the one comparing Morocco and Tunisia. Obviously, Jocelyne's paper compares 4 major countries. And then there is a comparison of Greece and Israel, Muslims minority in family course, Muslim family course, related to civil law. And you could say the comparison with India here is interesting, and so on. But otherwise, it's more each of the authors, and it's by reading it, the reader gets a sense of the comparative dimension. I have to confess that I should have written a final chapter trying to offer the kind of, but I decided no, it will be an attempt to basically to homogenize what is not. It is darn messiness that for me, and not being an expert, to even try to order this darn messiness wouldn't make sense. So, but again, as you know, on Iran, for instance, there is a very good, obviously, the prominent scholar of Iran and gender, Siva Mir Hosseini, and it's a very interesting approach after she had written so many different books, so many different essays, the particular way in the distinction between haq, right, and honor. What is the name? Nanus? What is in the honor in Farsi?
Oh, yes.
Because basically she uses the point is that the state took over the honor of the Iranian women, and now women, so the changing of the discourse from honor to rights, and the way in which women now have adopted it, and this was something which actually Abdul Karim Soroush had said, we will be able to take off rights when rights is a more important concept, political concept than honor. And then we are talking really, we've entered the discourse of rights. And I think that this is the very interesting way in which she brings this issue here. But please, Jocelyne.
Yeah, I would like to.
For the Sufi, I will let the
I would like
expert say something.
to try to combine my responses to your remarks. I mean, what works well for me in terms of comparison between Muslim majority country is indeed to distinguish between what I call this institutional secularization and the social one. And most of Muslim countries, the majority of them have done, it's more than appropriating Islam by the state. This is not just a strategy or policy, it's a complete change of vision of what you could call the immanent and the transcendent in some way, where the nation state everywhere has become the major regulator of the religious thinking. Most of the Islamic universities are state universities. The curriculum is controlled. There is no more free thinking in Muslim majority country. And this is true everywhere. This is not Iran, this is happening everywhere, right? Then you have the second level, which is the presence of religion in social life. And that's where you have the difference between Senegal and the majority of Muslim majority countries. Because in Senegal, there is a sort of differentiation between the state and religion, but the state has not absorbed the diversity of different religious organizations. In this case, these are the confrérie or the tariqas. But you go to Indonesia, it's the same thing. Indonesia is another state. It's not about Sufism. It is about, exactly, it's about the capacity of Islam to still have a meaning in social life. And in the state that went the further, what I call hegemonic Islam, that has made Islam the rule, not only institutionally, but as a parameter of social life, this makes the plurality internally to Islam, and a fortiori even more across religion, very, very challenging. And this is what I think can work. Look at what's the level of institution, and look at what's the level of presence of Islam and other religion in society. And about the point of women's rights, it's what I try to say. Women's rights in Iran have not been challenged when you come to economy, politics, and education. Far from it. Ahmadinejad had to make a quota for men in universities. So, okay. But you have to cover, so it goes back to the question of the body, of the question of the rights of the self, about family law, about the use and abuse of the muta, the temporary marriage. And so, again, if we want to compare, we cannot say women are like this in Iran versus Egypt, you see. I would say that economically and socially, women are better off in Iran than they are in Egypt or even Turkey now. So, but you have to dress, I'm not saying, this is not apologetic, it's just to show that there are different levels here we have to take into account. So I'll stop here because
And yes, really, there is a correlation, I would argue, between Sufi and pluralism. And insofar as a pluralist, I mean, the countries with Sufi tradition, clearly, you could say Indonesia, Bangladesh, Senegal, very strong. And precisely, it is this pluralism from below that doesn't want the state to take over Sharia and tell them how to be a good Orthodox Muslim. But Malaysia is very similar to Indonesia in terms of tradition, but Malaysia is one of the strongest cases of state Islamization. Yeah. And so there you have the comparison between Malaysia and Indonesia in this respect, very similar Sufi traditions, but then state Islamization of Islam in Malaysia, not in Indonesia, and different also forms of democracy also.
I think one thing we should never forget is that in many ways the structures of families and societies in traditional societies were not that different. I mean, the basic parameters of women's subjugation, there clearly are differences, but less marked by the religious tradition than by the cultures of different societies. So what we're actually seeing, and what I think we need to focus on, is the way that these different religious factors are dealing with a profound transformation, social transformation that's taking place. And that is the education. It is the dramatic decline in child mortality and therefore in fertility and family size and the employment, et cetera. And you see different levels of openness. On the Sufi issue, I have worked a lot with Fawzi Scali, who's a scholar of Sufism from Morocco, and his answer on Sufism is basically that it's really the vast majority of the Muslim world was Sufi in the sense of culture and structures. So certainly Morocco is Sufi. The whole of West Africa, Bangladesh, Indonesia, et cetera. So it's really the whole peripheries around the Arab world. So I think that even defining what's Sufi is difficult. But to sort of thinking, I mean, the Sufi traditions in Senegal are not exactly gender friendly, but the openness, I think, which is the point that you're making. But what we're seeing is complexifying, as a couple of you said.
In Indonesia, we see
that you're seeing with the migration patterns, with the political geopolitics, all of those. So in all of these situations, even the most tolerant, proudly tolerant societies, of which Senegal and Bangladesh are both I mean, they'll talk you to the moon and back about the importance of interreligious love and tolerance, et cetera, and yet we're seeing the rise of extremism reflected often in the symbol of women's roles. So some really ugly comments by both men and
It's
women.
always against your own heretics worse than against the others. You know. Okay, yes, the last question, and then we have to, unfortunately, time. Please.
My question is to Ms. Cesari. My name is Jocelyne. After listening to your diatribe about Ataturk and Alavites who have been quite a strong supporters of Ataturk, enjoyed
You were.
a lot of training, like ability to even opt out from religious classes in school. And I'm not aware of
This is what is.
because I was educated. I don't know how it is in villages, but in cities.
This is what is called having an experience and having an argument. My argument is indeed, in the beginning, the Alevi supported the nationalist movement. If you look at laws, if you look at facts, and I can document this, it's not my opinion, it's a fact. I'm not giving you my opinion. The Ataturk nationalized the Hanafi dominant school, created the Diyanet, put inside secular intellectuals, and completely ignored the religious diversity of Turkey as a national territory, including the Christians, the Alevi, and the Druze. These were the people who were not recognized by law in terms of their religious and ethnic identity. I'm sorry, you can contest this. I have read the textbook. The history of Turkey starts with Ataturk. Forget about the Ottoman Empire, the pluralism of the Ottoman Empire, and it's about an homogenization. Nationalism is about homogenization, and we know some in Europe as well. And it means that this diversity disappeared. I'm sorry, there have been lots of contestation with the European Union when Turkey had some hope to get into it. In Turkey, and this was under the Kemalists, not the Islamists, you have to mention your religion identity on the identity card. If you are Alevi, you do not exist.
As a religious. You exist as a group, but not as a religious.
You exist
You're
as
not recognized as a
persons.
Muslim.
Exactly. And you are not, you cannot identify yourself as a Sunni. So you had to write a sort of sign, and the discrimination is there. So again, what I'm saying is what we are reading today as a sort of Islamic or Muslim reaction to difference is ingrained, embedded in the building of the nation state across all Muslim countries. And this I'm very strong because I have studied that for 10 years now and documented it everywhere. So Alevi are actually better off Turkey. The diaspora, you should talk maybe to your counterpart in Europe, and they will tell you how it is easier to be an Alevi in Germany than in Turkey.
I mean, I had a student who wrote, herself an Alevi, who wrote a fantastic dissertation on the Alevis, how they went public. The coming of the Alevis is a public identity, and particularly in the diaspora. But she had a wonderful saying. The problem with Ataturk's project was it was too secular for the Sunni, too Turkish for the Kurds, and too Sunni for the Alevis. So it is this identification of Sunni Turkishness and secularism that precisely cannot recognize the Kurds as not Turks, cannot recognize the Alevis as not Sunnis, and ultimately the Sunnis were. So it's a very complicated story, it's not simple. Yeah. And obviously things have changed tremendously in Turkey with the Alevis in the 70s, in the 80s, but it was through the diaspora, and they came to the cities. You know, there were also a lot of conflicts later, but it's true that under Ataturk, as individuals, as secular individuals, they did quite well, but not as a group, not as Alevis, as a collective recognition. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you especially, Azza, for coming all the way from New York in a very busy schedule. And thank you to my collaborators, Thank you to all of you. Bye.
Thank you.